But how did Hitler do it? Well, with the support of millions of ordinary Germans who just wanted Germany to be great again, and business leaders who initially thought they could control him, plus a cadre of devout political allies willing to do whatever he said for the sake of power. A new piece by The Atlantic lays out how Hitler ended a German democracy and installed a dictatorship with blinding speed and entirely constitutional measures. In that period, Hitler emerged emboldened after being imprisoned for staging a coup. His rage and xenophobia gained followers after the financial ruin of World War I and the Great Depression, and helped get him selected as chancellor. Once in power, he moved with shock and awe.
We're going to come back to that report in a moment, but first I want to focus on the use of that term shock and awe, because we are currently in that phase of Donald Trump's power grab. In fact, a Republican senator even anonymously described his approach as, quote, shock and awe, where you bring about rapid change so as to overwhelm your political opponents. It's also been described as a flood the zone strategy by Steve Bannon, who says Monday you hit, you flood the zone. Second week you'll flood the zone. It's working. It's just stunning to me what they're doing, and it's not getting covered because it's too much. They're overwhelming the system. And that is exactly what is happening right now. Both Democrats and the media are struggling to keep up with everything that he's doing because it's just too much. That's by design, and it's working. In fact, the leader of House Democrats put out this cryptic tweet feigning powerlessness and basically said, well, it's in God's hands now, which doesn't necessarily instill confidence in his constituents who put him there to fight. But thankfully, Dems are at least vowing to fight. The problem is they're also preemptively conceding on multiple battles in order to focus on the main war, which is worrying. So NBC's Sahil Kapoor outlines their Trump 2.0 strategy, and here's what that's going to look like.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries held a private meeting with Democrats and warned them that the administration is going to flood the zone and that Democrats could not afford to chase every single outrage, or nothing was going to sink in for the voters. That's according to a source in the room who I spoke to. The next day, here's what he told reporters. Take a listen.
The House Republican contract against America is an extreme plan that will not lower costs for everyday Americans. It will make our country more expensive.
And that's going to sum up the Democratic message for the coming weeks and months that Republicans don't have a plan to address the concerns at the kitchen table. It means Democrats will focus less on cultural issues. We saw lots of them vote for the Laken Riley Act to crack down on undocumented immigrants and nonviolent crime. We also saw them refuse to take the bait on Trump's taunts over transgender rights, which they call a distraction from the lack of a Republican agenda. Senator Adam Schiff, who is in some ways the face of the first resistance, told me, quote, I think we have to pick our fights and not chase after every crazy squirrel.
Now, from purely a messaging standpoint, it makes sense to simplify it so you don't overwhelm voters with too much bullshit. But from a political and legal standpoint, you can't afford to not take the bait when it comes to issues like immigration and transgender rights, because even though the GOP does weaponize culture war issues to distract from economic issues, it doesn't change the fact that the culture war is not a victimless war. Innocent people are being detained by ICE, including veterans. Trans women are being transferred to men's prisons thanks to an executive order that Donald Trump signed, which will literally endanger their lives. Now, thankfully, a trans inmate is suing the Trump administration since this clearly infringes on her due process rights, but it shouldn't be left up to individuals to challenge this administration on their own. It's incumbent on the Democratic Party as the main opposition party to be an effective opposition party and respond with their own flood the zone approach. Right? It's their turn to do what Republicans did when Obama and Biden was president. They need to bog down this administration in every way they can, by obstructing, by suing them for every single illegal and unconstitutional move that they make. It is not in God's hands, Hakeem Jeffries. It's in your hands. And I don't expect Democrats to broadcast every single thing that they do to challenge this administration. Of course, stay focused on big picture issues. But what I do want to know is that Democrats are fucking fighting. And at this point in time, it's clear that not all of them are up to the task. But the thing about this shock and awe strategy is that it doesn't just overwhelm your opponents, it also demoralizes them. And the fact that we're already seeing signs that some Democrats are overwhelmed and exasperated is very worrying, to put it mildly, because as Joy Reid is going to explain in this next clip, Hitler's shock and awe succeeded, which then allowed him to inflict real damage on the country.
Once in power, he moved with shock and awe, imprisoning his liberal opposition. abolishing states' rights and imposing bans on left-wing newspapers. He fueled German public outrage by blaming European Jews for Germany's problems. Notably, he and his Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, launched a massive propaganda campaign that labeled Jews as carriers of deadly diseases and violent terrorists. Defeating the Jews of Europe, who they viewed as subhuman, was a question of good conquering evil, which conditioned millions of Germans to celebrate Hitler and turn a blind eye to his brutality. If that sounds vaguely familiar, that's because it is. Similarities to what happened in Germany and what's happening now in America are just undeniable. History may not repeat verbatim, but it sure does rhyme. Trump and Stephen Miller, his former director of speechwriting, depict non-white immigrants as carriers of deadly diseases who are violent terrorists. Trump was returned to the presidency after staging a coup and has exerted control of media or social media in order to parrot anti-immigrant vitriol and openly hateful anti-LGBTQ language, which is what Meta just did. And then there are the business leaders who pay him, fund him, and think they can control him.
In other words, Trump's strategy is straight out of Hitler's playbook, and it's being executed masterfully. And even if he never goes as far as Hitler did, we need to respond to this threat with the expectation that he will, because we can't afford to underestimate the threat that he poses. So on the subject of shock and awe, as you all know by now, Donald Trump instituted a freeze on federal funding that has wreaked havoc throughout the entire country. Disaster relief and government grants were frozen. Federal assistance programs were frozen. Worse, Medicaid portals were reportedly frozen in every single state, which meant that an estimated 90 million low-income Americans lost their health care like that. Now, at the time that I record this video, a federal judge has actually blocked his federal freeze, at least until February 3rd. And we also know that Medicaid portals have been restored, at least most of them, as far as we know. But at the time that I record this, we don't really know the implications of everything that's happening. And Trump's press secretary, at the time that this news broke on Tuesday, also didn't really know about the damage that they just inflicted on millions of Americans.
It wasn't clear to me whether you were saying that no Medicaid would be cut off. Obviously, a lot of this goes to states before it goes to individuals and so forth. So are you guaranteeing here that no individual now on Medicaid would see a cutoff because of the pause?
I'll check back on that.
We'll get back to you on that. Kind of important to know, right? Now, it might seem like they're just pushing random buttons and they don't really know what each one does, but they're pressing the button to see what it does. But in actuality, they do know what they're doing, to be clear. Jennifer Jacobs of CBS reports that the White House said they were looking into the Medicaid outage and claimed that it was unrelated to the federal funding pause. But as Congressman Maxwell Frost points out, that is complete and utter bullshit, and they're not owning this policy because they know it's unpopular. And I think that's true, but just because it's unpopular doesn't mean that Trump isn't going to do it. I mean, pardoning the January 6 prisoners was not popular, but he still did it anyway, and it didn't really affect his approval rating. But I think that Trump primarily did this for two main reasons. First, he's trying to test the waters to see how much he can actually get away with. And second, if he inflicts mass damage over here, you're probably not going to see what's going on over there. But when it comes to how much he's able to get away with, the goal here is to introduce a policy that's so fucking bad, it makes the other bad policies look reasonable. It's the political equivalent of putting a pill in peanut butter so your dog will swallow it, right? But what does that look like in practice? Well, Republicans might not defend the Medicaid freeze because that's really going to harm their own constituents, but they will defend the freeze on school lunch programs, which is still going to hurt their constituents, albeit to a lesser extent. Case in point.
When you talk about school lunches, hey, I worked my way through high school. I don't know about you, but I worked since I was, before I was even 13 years old. I was picking berries in the fields before we had child labor laws that precluded that. I was a paper boy. And when I was in high school, I worked my entire way through. You're telling me that kids who stay at home instead of going to work at Burger King and McDonald's during the summer should stay at home and get their free lunch instead of going to work? I think we need to have a top-down review.
I think you're painting a lot of these kids with a broad brush. I would say that's not necessarily a fair assessment of all of the kids. So you would say all the kids in your district who use the free lunch, for example, or breakfast, they're all just sitting at home and not working. Okay, I just want to clarify because that seems like what you were trying to insinuate.
This gives us a chance. This gives us a chance, though, to see where is the money really being spent. who can actually go and actually produce their own income? Who can actually go out there and do something that makes them have value and work skills for the future? I mean, how many people got their start in fast food restaurants when they were kids versus just giving a blanket rule that gives all kids lunches in high school who are capable of going out and actually getting a job and doing something that makes them have value, thinking about their future instead of thinking about how they're going to sponge off the government when they don't need to.
So that Republican congressman thinks it's a good idea to deny kids meals because they shouldn't be sponging off the government, because these kids should be working as opposed to, you know, being kids and focusing on their schoolwork. We're seeing in real time how politicians are able to shift the Overton window to the right. They want you to think that letting students go hungry is reasonable because when compared to, say, letting poors die by denying them Medicaid coverage, you know, letting kids go hungry sounds reasonable by comparison. That is how Trump is going to get away with so much, by creating that type of juxtaposition. But that brings me to the second reason why I think he's doing this: to create temporary distractions that are going to allow him to solidify permanent policy changes that really harm people. And I say this because while everyone was sent into a frenzy over this funding freeze, and rightfully so, by the way, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have been sent into a frenzy, but while people were focused on that, a lot of people might have missed the fact that Trump actually crippled the National Labor Relations Board at the same time by firing a Democratic member named Gwen Wilcox. And as labor lawyer Matt Brunig points out, this means that the NLRB now lacks quorum and cannot issue decisions. In other words, employers can exploit and abuse their workers with impunity so long as the NLRB is not able to reach a quorum. So if he faces enough backlash and undoes the pause on federal spending and Medicaid coverage is resumed and there's no issues going forward, that's awesome. But that doesn't change the fact that he's probably going to get away with this attack on the agency that is supposed to protect worker rights, since the lion's share of the time is being spent on the bigger threat, which is to people's health. So this shock and awe approach lets him get away with so much more than he's usually able to get away with. He's learned since he was in office that first time. Because, you know, the NLRB is a scandal in and of itself, what he did there. But if he does several scandalous things simultaneously, people are naturally going to focus on the biggest scandals that affect the most people. And the Medicaid freeze is the biggest scandal, because Americans without healthcare could literally die. Low-income parents rely on Medicaid for so many things. I mean, people give birth with Medicaid coverage. That pause could leave them with thousands of dollars in medical bills that could bankrupt them. They can't afford it, hence why they're on Medicaid in the first place, because they qualify because they're low income. So this is why this shock and awe approach is so damn effective. The goal is to overwhelm everyone to the point where they just give up and tune out. But I'd be remiss to not talk about other genuinely disastrous moves that he's making that he's hoping you're not going to notice. For example, he signed an executive order that lays the groundwork for the deportation of students who express pro-Palestinian sentiment. And yet everybody says that, oh, he's the free speech guy. The Republican Party is the First Amendment party. But yet we see this to no pushback whatsoever from Republicans. And just to be clear, these are students who are here legally, but they're being treated as if they're criminals if they dare to condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza. That is not allowed here. You can't object to war crimes that our government is supporting. And it's not just innocent foreign students who are at risk of deportation, because Trump has also laid the groundwork to deport American citizens as well.
Listen to me carefully. There is a private agreement being created right now between Trump and El Salvador's president to create an encampment in Salvador to deport U.S. citizens.
I don't want these violent repeat offenders in our country any more than I want illegal aliens from other countries who misbehave. I want them out of our country. I get them the hell out of our country along with others. Let them be brought to a foreign land and maintained by others for a very small fee as opposed to be maintained in our jails. You know, let them be brought out of our country and let them live there for a while. Let's see how they...
Now pay attention, because the groundwork is being laid right in front of our eyes and the media has fucking failed us. The Trump administration is developing an asylum agreement with El Salvador's government that would allow the U.S. to deport migrants who are not from there. The arrangement known as the Safe Third Country Agreement would empower U.S. immigration officials to deport non-Salvadorian migrants to El Salvador, and once they're there, block them from requesting asylum back into the United States. Andrew, Trump already signed an executive order that allows him and the DOJ to create private contracts with private prisons, to create more private prisons. And the reason why he wanted to do that was because those were going to be the migrant detention centers. But now he's saying those private prison contracts are too fucking expensive.
The private prison companies that charge us a fortune.
He wants to outsource them to Salvador. He thinks he's running this country like a business. And it hits harder when you know the facts, that in 2021, black Americans were imprisoned at 5 times the rate of whites, while American Indians and Latinx people were imprisoned 4.2 and 2.4 times the rate of white people. When he's saying he wants to deport repeat offenders and criminals, that's who he's talking about. Make no mistake about it, the groundwork and foundation for Project 2025 has been laid right in front of our eyes. They're letting us know exactly what American superiority looks like.
Yeah. And what he's pointing out here has gone largely unnoticed because of everything else that's happening. I mean, shock and awe, right? But it's worrying, especially considering how Republicans have already raised the specter of deporting U.S. citizens. I mean, Mike Collins last week tweeted that the pastor who offended Donald Trump by asking him to have mercy should be deported. But while the goal is to deport some citizens, others have to worry about the prospect of not being able to leave. For example, LGBTQ plus activist Reid is advising trans and non-binary people to not mail in their passports at this time, to update them, or for whatever reasons, since the State Department isn't recognizing trans identities and they're not giving people timelines when they're going to be returned, which means that you could very well not get your passport back if you're trans, which will restrict your travel, which is essential right now if things continue to go south. And yesterday, in the middle of the chaos that he caused due to his federal freeze, he released a sweeping executive order curtailing gender-affirming healthcare for all trans people under the age of 19. We're talking about adults here as well. Now, at the time that I record this video, it's unclear how this is going to directly affect trans youth, especially in blue states. But even if there is a minimal effect, it could be catastrophic for trans youth. The good news is that this doesn't go into effect right away, and it will be challenged because it is illegal. But it just goes to show you how much he's doing at such a fast pace. Now, there's also other ostensibly small changes that he's making that don't seem immediately consequential, but in the long term, they're going to prove to be disastrous. For example, he also put a pause on communications from all federal health agencies. So while the FDA can still notify the public of recalls, at least for now, they are not allowed to provide the public with updates to outbreaks linked to contaminated food. Moreover, the CDC can't issue mortality reports or guidance and updates to diseases, nor can they offer updates to the public about flu and COVID-19 vaccination rates, which were used by local health authorities to provide outreach to communities that were lagging behind the rest of the country. Now, on top of that, the United States Agency for International Development was told to halt work immediately, which means that developing countries are being cut off from life-saving treatment for HIV, for malaria, tuberculosis. This also means they're not going to be able to distribute medical supplies to newborn babies in these countries, which is crucial and life-saving. And last week, Trump floated the idea of abolishing FEMA, which would be utterly catastrophic for states in Tornado Alley and more hurricane-prone areas, and I can assure you we are not even scratching the surface. He signed more than 200 executive orders on day one, and it hasn't stopped. He's still signing executive orders, and this is all part of his shock and awe campaign. And a majority of the executive orders that he signed, by the way, were either partially or fully outlined in Project 2025, according to an analysis by Time. And his federal freeze is also part of Project 2025 as well, by the way. And remember, the goal of Project 2025 is to dismantle the administrative state and consolidate power into the executive branch, so that way there's no more checks. And here's how the federal spending freeze in particular advances that specific goal. Cameron Cordray writes, quote, temporary bullshit aside, this is a clear attempt to steal the single most important legislative power, budget making, and centralize it under the executive. Fundamentally anti-constitutional and blatantly authoritarian. This is genuine DEFCON 1 shit. He continues, it has been decided several times in both the Supreme Court and the halls of Congress that the president does not have the authority to withhold or deny congressional funding in this matter. It's equivalent to senators attempting to give orders to the military. So we're arguably looking at a constitutional crisis on week 2. Not to mention, in week 1, on day 1 in particular, he tried to overturn birthright citizenship, which is literally codified in the U.S. Constitution, something he cannot do. But putting aside the policy implications of all of these things that he's doing, this is all being done because he's trying to grab power, right? The shock and awe approach is being masterfully used to help him consolidate power. It's working. He has completely and utterly incapacitated the federal government. And even though it is important for Democrats to not get bogged down by every little thing that he does and focus on, how this isn't going to bring down the cost of eggs, they also have to call a spade a spade. They have to describe this as the power grab that it is. I get that the whole democracy argument didn't really resonate with Americans, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't explain how what is happening here is genuinely destructive. And if the last message didn't work, they've got to revise it and make it land, because this is something that every American should care about. right? Now, I've been critical of Democrats, but now I do want to give some of them credit because, aside from leadership, which is completely useless and feckless in my opinion, there are Democrats who are not getting bogged down by Trump's shock and awe campaign. And those people who are not getting bogged down are progressives like AOC and Bernie Sanders. And they're not just pointing out that none of these moves are helping working class people. They're also providing Americans with something else, an alternative vision, which is what has been lacking from the Democratic Party for quite some time and why their message wasn't landing with working class people. Because you can pinpoint problems, that's fine, that does work, but you also have to provide people with solutions. Trump was able to tap into this populism where he acknowledged problems that people were facing, but the solution that he provided, the vision that he provided was fascist, and there was just no alternative to compete with that. The way that you defeat fascism, right-wing populism, in other words, is with left-wing populism, with true leftism. So Democrats have got to copy AOC and Bernie Sanders. And it's not just the progressives, to be clear, even though I do have my disagreements with senators like Chris Murphy. I think that he's been really effective at calling out Trump's authoritarianism. Case in point.
So this is an attempt by Donald Trump to seize power. That sounds like a provocative thing to say, but how else do you describe what we have watched happen over the last week? The broad immunization of political violence, the illegal firing of inspectors general there to make sure that their money, that the money of the taxpayers isn't stolen. And today, the illegal and unconstitutional decision to put the President of the United States and no one else in charge of who gets federal money and who doesn't. What President Trump is doing is seizing control of the federal budget and deciding by himself who gets money and who doesn't. For two reasons. One, he wants to bank money so that he can afford his massive tax cut for billionaires and corporations. But second, so that he can hand out money to his friends, to the companies that are run by his billionaire donors, to states that voted for him, to congressional districts with members of Congress who are loyal to him, and so that he can deny money to any organization run by Democrats, to companies that are competitors to his billionaire friends, to congressional districts represented by his political opponents. This is what a king does. This is not how a democracy works. One man does not decide how taxpayers' money is spent so that it only gets sent to the president's political friends and it gets used to punish his political enemies. The scope of the damage that will be done is enormous.
And I think that's a good start. Listen, Republicans turned every single thing that Obama and Biden did into political scandals. Obama was knocked for wearing a tan suit and not properly saluting the troops. And Democrats need to do that exact same thing. Copy the Republicans. Turn everything that Donald Trump does into the biggest scandal ever, because it is. Don't get overwhelmed by the shock and awe. Use it to your advantage. Give voters an alternative vision. You have to obstruct every single thing that he does, and that means you stop fucking voting to confirm his cabinet picks, senators. You stop voting for their right-wing policies, right? Behave in a way that bogs him down. Behave as if you were a Republican in Congress while a Democrat is president. Respond to the situation with the urgency that it requires. Sue him every fucking time he breaks the law or violates the Constitution. Democrats are the ones who should be leading the charge, and they've got to explain to the American people that they are doing all of this to defend them, not just on mainstream media, not by tweets, but by going to rallies, town halls, podcasts. Like, meet people where they are, and you've got to have all hands on deck. Every Democrat has to have a unified message. Otherwise, Trump is going to get away with most of this shit. And right now, not all Democrats seem willing to fight. In fact, a lot of them are capitulating. 12 Senate Democrats collaborated with fascists to vote for the Lake and Riley Act, which denies immigrants due process rights. Now, in the House, Democratic leaders, they're basically invisible. I mean, you see younger, more progressive members like AOC, as I mentioned, and even Maxwell Frost publicly challenging Trump. But leadership, they're not really anywhere to be found. Although they are planning an emergency meeting, but I kid you not, it's happening a day after Trump's federal spending freeze sent the country into chaos. I mean, what are we doing? If it's an emergency meeting, that means everyone returns to DC right now to fight. Otherwise, it's not really being treated like an emergency meeting, despite you calling it that. And the reason why I'm being so hard on Democrats, leadership in particular, is because they're supposed to be the main check on Trump's abuse of power. They're supposed to protect us from the damage that he is going to inflict on us. And they're not going to be effective at doing that if they don't have the energy to fight. And they have to be a strong opposition party. Otherwise, Trump is going to overwhelm them. And democracy, as a result, is not going to be here for the long term. So let's learn from the past and be cognizant of the fact that Trump is using the same playbook as every fascist throughout history. And let's make sure that our opposition is stronger than the opposition parties of the past who failed when it came time to stop fascism.
Mike is a total shitlib. Once he started shilling for the DNC, I stopped watching. So I definitely won't be hitting the subscribe button or turning on notifications by clicking the bell. No way. It's very sad, I know.